My name is Amy Jo Detweiler, and I am an extension horticulturist with the OSU Extension Service, and I'm based here in Central Oregon. I work with homeowners, backyard growers, some commercial horticultural folks, and I train the Master Gardener volunteers for the region. I work here, I'm based in the Redmond Extension Office, and I serve Crook, Deschutes, and Jefferson counties. And just to give you a little background on what the Oregon State University Extension Service does is we bring the research-based information to our communities in the state of Oregon. And so that's what we'll be doing this morning, is talking about some pruning techniques in the landscape. And I'll be teaching the class, and then I also have Tony Steffen with me. She's another staff member in our extension office here in Redmond, and she will be answering your questions. So if you have questions as we go, if you can type them into the Q&A box, she'll try and answer them as we go, and then at the end I'll take a look at those questions too and review any and share some with the audience as a whole. So feel free to type your questions in as we go. And you can also put in there, if for some reason you can't hear us or something changes, you can type that in there so we're aware of that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about pruning the landscape, and let's see here. An overview of today's class is, why and when you should prune, reasons for pruning, timing on pruning. We'll talk specifically about pruning techniques so that you're making the right types of pruning cuts. And we're going to focus mostly on tree pruning and the different types of shrubs. And then I'll cover some resources. So just to start out by giving you a definition of what pruning is. Here's the formal definition: a selective removal of plant parts to maintain health, vigor, control, flowering, and fruiting. But I highlighted the word selective here just because pruning should not be something that you automatically feel the need to do. It shouldn't just be one of those routine spring gardening chores that you feel like you have to get out every year and do pruning. Really, it should be with thought and purpose in mind for that particular plant. Now, with things like perennials that die back to the ground every year, yeah, we've got to be pruning those back and taking off the dead debris. But with shrubs and trees, you don't necessarily have to be pruning them every year unless there's a need. So some of the top reasons you would think about pruning is for shaping, and you really should be doing more pruning on young trees versus older ones. The idea is that if you have a tree when it's young, especially if you've purchased one, you put it in the ground yourself, then you can start to shape it and keep it nice and open. And we'll talk about some of those techniques later. Versus your older trees, as they're maturing, you should see less and less need to be pruning out your older trees. With the exception of a few inherited trees. Sometimes you move to a new property, you inherit a tree that maybe never had any pruning done. So then all of a sudden you're needing to prune that tree and retroactively. Other reasons to prune, just to eliminate future problems. Sometimes it's a great tool for rejuvenating ornamental shrubs in particular, to rejuvenate the flowers and or fruits on a plant. And then safety is another good reason for pruning. You go to back out of the driveway and that shrub's gotten too big and you can't quite see the way you need to. That's another reason you'd want to be pruning. Pruning helps to maintain plant health. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But really, it's just about only when there's a reason to prune. It seems that most folks like to prune to control the size of a plant. And the issue with that is plants are genetically geared to get to a certain mature height. So if your primary purpose in pruning is to try and control the size of the plant, it's probably going to be an ongoing battle, and it probably is something you're going to need to be doing more frequently. Ideally, we would encourage you to, if you're buying plants for the first time, buy the right plant for the right place, meaning take a look at the mature size of that plant so that you don't have to do unnecessary pruning on it. But I've seen that in most cases when you have pruning that doesn't look so great, it's because someone is trying to control the size of the plant. And we'll talk about techniques for doing a little bit of that, but ultimately that's not the ideal goal with pruning. Here you can see in this slide, you can see this is a Norway maple, and you can see there's a big issue right here, right in the center of this slide, something not so great going on there. And obviously you can see this was an issue of the tree interfering with the power line. So there was a need to do that. But this is the type of situation you want to avoid. So if you have the choice and you're buying plants, you just want to make sure you buy the right plants for the right place. And if not, hopefully you don't have to end up doing something like this down the road. Here's just another example. These are arborvitae. This, you know, they're putting this very tiny raised bed next to the building. You can see it outgrowing the space. So this is going to be an ongoing pruning issue to keep these maintained in this area. And again, this is just about plant selection and putting the right plant in the right place so that you don't have to be pruning something like this all the time. So a little bit of science here, just to give you some information about what happens when you prune. So this is an example of a branch on a tree. And you can see here, you've got your newest growth right here. This would be the last season's growth. It starts right about here where you have this kind of scar tissue from the bud from the season before. You've got a year's worth of growth right here. I want to tell you about the chemical auxin and why that's important. So auxin, it's a plant hormone that helps, whoops, let's go back. That helps to inhibit the growth of the lateral buds. And so hang on a second, whoops, screen's jumping ahead for me. And so what auxin does is auxin is found in that terminal bud, or that apical bud. And so it's really important for you to know that when you prune off a branch from the terminal bud back, you remove the auxin that is there, and that auxin helps control those lateral buds. So when you prune back, say an inch from that terminal bud, then there's a race between the lateral buds to become the new dominant or terminal bud. And so then you'll get a flush of side growth because you've removed the auxin, which helps maintain that. And so in some cases, this may be a good idea if you're trying to fill in a shrub, but also know that it will create a flush of growth along that stem where all those lateral buds are sitting. And so it's important to know the role of auxin and how it affects the lateral growth there, because that can change the shape of the plant. So timing, when to prune. This is probably the one of the most common questions I get asked by homeowners is, you know, when should I prune? So it depends on why you're pruning as to when you should prune. Safety, if it's a safety issue, like I mentioned, you can prune any time of the year. Just go ahead and take the steps to prune the right way. Structural pruning, meaning you're trying to kind of form the shape of the tree in particular, is best done in spring. And usually in Central Oregon, that's going to be between March and April when you're going to want to do that. Most plants can be pruned between March and April, and there's a few exceptions to that, and we'll talk about those. But general rule of thumb is March to April for structural pruning. And that's primarily because the leaves haven't come out yet on the tree, and so you can see the branch pattern really well. So if you're trying to open up the plant or just take out any problem branches, you would be able to do that without the leaves disrupting the view. And you can actually prune really any time during the growing season. There's not really a bad time. Spring's just easier when the leaves aren't out yet on your deciduous trees. But you can prune in the summer months as well if you need to. It's not going to be detrimental to the plant. And I tell folks you can prune really probably up through September. Now, once you start to head into October, if you're trying to prune your deciduous trees or shrubs, as I just mentioned, when you make that pruning cut and remove that terminal bud, then all of a sudden you'll get a flush of growth. And so the plants are trying to go dormant come October as the temperatures cool. And if they're being forced to push out new growth and sustain new growth, that's hard on the plant system. And so it's not ideal to prune late in the season. So usually as early as March here, maybe into September. Winter pruning is not generally recommended for Central Oregon because for that same reason, if you start pruning, say January or February, you may get a flush of growth coming out right in the middle of our winter, and that new growth may get damaged by cold injury, and then you have dieback where you have cold injury. And so I tell folks usually to wait till the beginning of March in most cases. The exception to timing on when to prune would be with conifers. And the recommended time for conifers, in particular pine trees, is going to be November through February. They're going to be the winter ones to prune here. And that's all related to an insect pest problem we have on our pine trees called Sequoia pitch moth. It's when you get the large masses of pitch along the trunk of the tree. We see it a lot on our ponderosa pine, our native pine here. And if you're pruning during the summer months with your pine trees, that's when the adult Sequoia pitch moth is out in flight. That's when the female moth is in flight, and she is attracted to the scent of pitch. And so if she smells a fresh pruning cut, she'll go and lay her eggs on the pruning cut, and then you have larvae that will reside there in that open pruning cut or wound and go into the tree. And then you end up, the tree starts to try and push out the larvae. And so you get these pitch masses that start to drip down the tree. So that's the reason you want to avoid doing any kind of pruning on your pine trees in the summer months. Keep that to the winter months when the adult female moth is not in flight. With the exception, of course, of safety. Again, if you have to prune for safety reasons, go ahead and do that. Other things to think about as far as when to prune. Depends on the flower of the plant. If you have ornamental plants in your landscape, you need to know if they flower on the old wood from last year's season or if they flower on new wood that grows in the current season. And so, for example, our lilacs, a common ornamental plant that works well here in Central Oregon. This is an example of a plant that the flower buds are set on last year's growth. So when the plant is done growing at the end of the season last summer, the terminal bud that sets are the flower buds. So if you were to prune those in March, you're going to be cutting off the flower buds, and so you won't get your blooms. So you need to be aware of that for your ornamental plants that have flowers. You need to know when they flower, and do they flower on old wood or new wood, meaning the current season's growth. And just make sure. And if you're not sure, if you have a plant and you don't know what the plant is, you can always contact us to help you identify the plant. Or if you know the plant, but you're just not sure when it flowers on the old wood or the new wood, give us a call and we'll be able to help advise you there as far as when to best prune the plant. And just again to show you what the plants that bloom on the current season's wood, that means as the plant starts growing actively in April and May and June, then as that branch elongates, you'll get a terminal flower. Those ones can be pruned in March still because the new growth hasn't started to actively grow. And so even into April a little bit, you can go ahead and prune some of those plants that actually bloom on current season's wood. An example of that would be an ornamental hydrangea. This is one of the ones that works well here in Central Oregon. This variety is called Annabelle. It's Hydrangea paniculata Annabelle. And this would be one where you could go in right now and prune back your hydrangea if they're the right type of hydrangea. You need to know what kind you have again. And then the new growth will come up and it'll bloom later in the season. We get a lot of questions related to fruit tree pruning, and I'm just going to encourage you to do some of your own investigation here. Fruit tree pruning can be very different than just routine pruning in a landscape setting, because with fruit tree pruning, you're trying to potentially maximize the amount of fruit set that you get. So to be honest, that's an entire other webinar all on its own because it looks very different than traditional pruning. The best way for you to find, there's some really good fruit tree pruning videos that are already done by other universities. And you can access those if you go and do a Google search, just type in the words pruning videos site with a :edu, and that'll bring up all the research-based pruning videos. So these are going to be videos done by other universities that are going to show you the right techniques for pruning certain types of fruit trees. To answer when should you be pruning your fruit trees in Central Oregon, it's generally going to be early March here again when you're pruning those. I'll talk a little bit more about fruit tree pruning, I'll cover it very briefly here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. Tools. Really, what kind of tools should you have for pruning? The three that I like the most and that that will get you by most easily are going to be these three right here. The bypass pruner, the bypass lopper, and a tri-cut pruning saw are going to be probably the most common tools used by homeowners. There are larger tools as branches get wider in diameter and trees get larger. And at some point you may require a pole pruner for taller branches and or just some larger equipment to get certain branches down. But usually if you're talking about really large limbs, in most cases, people are hiring a certified arborist for something like that. You'll notice here in the picture, I also have a bottle that's rubbing alcohol, and I use that to spray my tools, particularly between plants. If I'm taking out a branch that looked diseased, like it might have had a fungal pathogen or bacteria or something like that, I don't want to transfer that disease to my next tree that I prune or cut on. So I'm going to want to make sure that I'm spraying, and you could even be doing it between pruning cuts on the same tree. So just make sure that you have a way to disinfect your tools so that you're not spreading disease potentially. If you're pruning a healthy tree, you don't have to necessarily worry about it, but it's just a good practice to have a bottle of rubbing alcohol, or you could even use the disinfecting wipes to wipe down your tools. And then you can see here also just how you use these tools. So the bypass pruner is where you have a blade on top and you have the hook below, and you can go ahead and use that for anything less than about 1/4 of an inch. And the loppers are used for anywhere from between 1/4 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch. And then any time you get to a branch that's about 1 inch or wider in diameter, then you probably should jump up to using a pruning saw. So I just wanted to hone in on this a little bit. And one of the nice things I like about the lopper is getting one that has a bumper like this. If you can see this arrow where I'm pointing, that's just going to reduce fatigue if you're having to do a lot of cutting. And then also on the pruning saw, the tri-cut blade, what's nice about that, because you can use a regular saw, but the tri-cut blade makes it so that when you're cutting through the push and the pull of the action when you're moving it. And you're going to get through that limb a lot quicker than some regular saws. It's just going to be one direction where you're getting the cutting action. And so the pruning saws work really nicely for that reason. Okay, and so then I throw this picture in just kind of in a small way here, and these are pruning hedges or shears, or pruning shears for hedges, excuse me. And so you can see that can be used on certain shrubs here, but we really don't have a lot of shrubs that grow well in Central Oregon that require the hedge shears. And so I don't see a need to use these often, which is why I kind of threw it in there last. So you can definitely have a pair of these. I tend to use something like this more often with ornamental grasses and that sort of thing. But you can use that on some shrubs, but most of the shrubs we have here, you're not using a shear like this. And we'll talk more about that on some of the ones that you can use, but we have just a handful here that would respond well to heavy shearing. Okay, positioning the pruners. This is really important skill or technique to learn. You want to make sure that you're putting the pruners on the branch the right way, because you can have the blade either closest to the part that's staying or further away. And ideally, you're putting it closest to the part that remains. If you flip it the other way around, the blade, the way the bypass pruner or loppers are designed, then the blade's a little further away from the part that stays. And so you're coming out a little further than ideal. So make sure that you're lining up the blade to the part of the plant that stays, and that'll get you the closest cut possible. So you're going to want to use the right size tool and make sure that you're lining it up that way. And we'll talk about where to make those pruning cuts here in a minute. Okay. So here you have some examples of proper pruning cuts and pruning above the bud. You can see the ideal angle you want to achieve for most pruning cuts if you're cutting into part of a branch and not taking it all the way back to the main branch or limb would be a 45-degree angle, and that's going to be considered a good cut. If you are too angular, like the next picture over, then you're going to end up with a cut that doesn't quite close properly. And the technical term is compartmentalize, but that means that the plant won't quite close off correctly, and you'll end up with some dead tissue here on the top of that too angular cut, or the cut here that's too high. You're going to end up with dead tissue that opens up the plant for disease and dieback. And so you can go ahead and try and make that angular cut. And this is for an alternate budded plant. That means you have a bud and then you have some space on the branch and another bud above it. And so you don't want to go between the two buds. You want to make sure you're going right above the angle. And then if you go too close to the bud, then you're going to be cutting into, and you're going to end up with some dieback there as well. There's actually some chemical component to the plant. If you make that 45-degree angle, it has the ability, there's a chemical zone there that has the ability to keep bacteria out and actually compartmentalize, which is basically means close over the wound and close it off correctly. On opposite budded plants here at the end, then you can see that you can go right above the two buds, and again, that's going to put you right in that chemical zone that's going to allow that plant tissue to close off correctly. So if you're just making a simple cut on a branch, you're going to follow this instruction, whether it's alternate budded or opposite budded. Okay. Pruning principles. Okay, general rules of thumb. No more than 1/3 of the overall branch canopy in a given season. And so you want to make sure you follow this for the most part. You really should not be going in and taking out more than half the canopy in any one season. It's really hard on the plant, because every time you remove a branch, you're removing potential leaves that provide food for the plant and the root system of the plant. So if you go in, if you inherited a tree that's never been pruned, it looks terrible, you really want to get to it. Ideally, do that over a couple of seasons, not just in one season. And so no more than 1/3 in any one season, just kind of eyeball it. So no more than 30% of the canopy each year, and then just be patient and take your time in pruning it if it's a really messy tree that really needs some serious pruning. Um, here's the anatomy of a tree, and we can talk about the different parts. And let's go back here. Okay, so when you're looking at, you know, troubleshooting a tree, there's just some different parts that I'm going to mention here as far as parts to prune. So you can see here the base is suckers. Suckers are just plant parts that really aren't necessary for the tree. And so you can always remove suckers anytime during the season. Just go ahead and we'll see those are commonly on your apple trees, crab apples, anything in the prunus family tends to sucker. So some species are really well known for suckering right at the base there of the trunk. And so go ahead and take those out. The water sprouts are going to be the ones that you see on branches that kind of go straight up towards the sky. Those are not going to end up being good branches to keep on the plant. They're weak wooded, and they usually, the angle is such that it's not going to be ideal as they mature. So go ahead and take out any of those water sprouts. Let's just, scaffolding branches are going to be the main branches that you're trying to keep, and ideally 45-degree angle branches are ones that hold up well and that mature well over time. So you want to encourage that. So if you start to go down and you're thinking, okay, I have this tree, I don't know what to do with it, what do I do first? Probably the best thing you can do is remove all dead, diseased, or damaged wood. And so you can go to the base, anything that's dead, a dead branch doesn't really count in that 1/3 rule of thumb. You just go ahead and take that out. You can remove any cross branches, and I'll show you some examples of that, and remove any of the suckers or water sprouts. So you start with that checklist or guide, and just go ahead and start to take some of those out. If you had some winter damage, you see some dead branches, just go ahead and remove those from the get-go. Cross branches, like you can see here, anything growing in towards the center of the tree can be removed. And here's some examples of rubbing or cross branching. This is going to be something you want to take care of. As, for example, where you see those black arrows pointing, these are some water sprouts growing up, and then right here you can see this branch is hitting on this branch. So over time, as the plant grows, the diameter of those branches get wider, you're going to have more and more rubbing occurring every time the wind blows, and that's going to open up some wounds on that plant and cause some issues there. So you want to make a choice on which branch looks like a less desirable branch and take that one out to prevent that rubbing or cross branch placement. Here's another example over here where you can go ahead and take that branch out so that you don't have that rubbing action going on. That's just going to create problems for the tree. Other things you want to try to remedy if you've inherited a tree, and even when it comes to buying a tree, is you want to avoid buying something that has codominant stems, because usually what happens with the codominant stems is as the plants get larger and larger in size, the plant becomes more of a hazard tree with the codominant stems. So you can see a couple examples here. This is a prunus on the left, and you have these 3 stems. You can kind of see where this bark is in the middle. That's going to create a weak angle or branch that the plant's really not connected here. And so if you get any heavy wind, snow, weight on that branch, then you're going to have that potentially tear or break off. So try initially not to purchase a tree that has codominant stems, but if you have a tree that it's developed over time, now what I do, you might want to make a decision to remove one of the codominant stems so that you don't end up with a damaged tree down the road. You can see here's a large example of a limb that came off because of codominant stems. You can see how that tears down the trunk. And right in through here, there was what's called included bark, and that included bark is just a vulnerable or a weak point as trees mature and the limbs get heavier and larger in size. Here's kind of a side angle view of what that narrow crotch angle looks like, and you can see this is the included bark in here that makes it a weak wooded plant or weak branch angle. Ideally, as I mentioned, you're looking for a 45-degree angle on most trees. Now, some trees, if you're buying a more narrow upright tree, a cultivar that's more upright in growth habit, then you're not going to have 45-degree angles. But most trees, the ideal growth angle is going to be 45 degrees. And if you don't have that, you can sometimes train it out of that or correct it when it's young by putting in a splint. Okay, now I want to shift to talking about just making a good pruning cut on large limbs of trees. And so you can use this technique. It's a 3-step cut. And step 1 would be to make what's called the undercut. So you go away from the main trunk of the tree. This is going to be for large limbs on trees. You go away from that first, and you make this first cut, and you're going in about 1/3 of the branch size. And it's so you're not going all the way through. You're just going in about 1/3 the distance on the diameter of that tree. And then you go a couple of inches out away from that first cut, further out on the branch, and you make that second cut. It's called the top cut. And you make the top cut, you go all the way through. So as you go through that top cut, it's going to tear down, and it won't tear all the way down into the main trunk, which is what you want to try and avoid because of the weight of the branch. It'll just tear and it'll stop where you made that first undercut. And then you make the third and final cut where you make the proper cut up close to the main trunk. And I'll show you more details on that here in a minute. So when you're removing a large limb from a tree, you have what's called the bark ridge zone and the branch collar. The branch collar is an area right before you get to the main trunk of the tree. It's kind of a swollen area sometimes. There's just a little bit of a change in the diameter of the regular branch, and it gets a little bit larger there. And that branch collar is going to be the area that you want to be looking for. You look for the branch collar and the bark ridge, and that's where you're going to make your pruning cut. So here's another better example. You've got this bark ridge where you can see a change in texture from the bark. It's kind of usually rough, a little more potentially raised up there. You've got this branch bark ridge, and then you've got the collar. Again, here's the regular diameter. You can see a little bit of a change in diameter here. You don't want to be pruning into that bark ridge collar because, again, this is coming back to there's chemicals in that chemical zone. If you make the proper pruning cut in that chemical zone, they're going to help the tree to compartmentalize once the pruning cut has been made. So where you want to be making the pruning cut on large limbs is going to be right at that branch collar. So you can see here on the right where it says yes, that's where you'd make that cut. If you go in past the branch collar, then the plant's going to have a harder time closing off or compartmentalizing. Okay, I'm going to try and show you a pruning video right now. That's he just does a really nice job kind of summarizing some of what we've already talked about. Hopefully you'll be able to see and hear this.
Trees in the built environment require some maintenance in order to get along with other elements on the site. Typically, pruning is thought of as simply keeping a plant in its place or just making it smaller. In reality, pruning is necessary to improve clearance, reduce risk, improve aesthetics, and good plant health care. Plant selection plays a role in pruning. Be sure when you're planting a new tree, you select a tree with a good, strong central leader system and not one that's got a codominant stem. This is an example of a codominant stem. You can see the wide angles here, and there's no real central leader system. As a tree grows, this will have a risk of splitting, which could be a potential risk or hazard later on. The equipment for pruning is fairly simple. The majority of the work can be completed with 3 simple tools. First, we have the bypass pruners, which is for branch sizes of less than 1/4 inch. The next we have the bypass loppers, and this is typically from 1/4 inch up to 3/4 inch. For anything larger than 1 inch in diameter, you want to use a pruning saw. This has a specialized tri-cut blade, which is made especially for pruning branches. Pruning is considered one of the best worst maintenance practices performed on trees. The reason is that pruning is actually wounding the tree in order to accomplish our objectives. Wounds can lead to disease and decay if they're not pruned properly. Also, excessive pruning or poorly timed pruning can lead to stress, decline, and even death. Never top a tree. This is a sure way to weaken the tree structurally. Topping is actually excessive pruning between branch growing points, leaving stubs and wounds which lead to decay and dieback. There should be a purpose for every cut that you make on a tree based on the objectives for pruning. The primary objective of pruning should be to develop a strong structure. Structural pruning of younger trees can be a holistic approach to training young plants to grow into stronger, safer, and healthier trees. Some of the objectives of pruning include removing non-beneficial plant parts such as basal sprouting. Other non-beneficial plant parts include epicormic sprouting, which are those vertical branches growing up in the tree. And finally, other non-beneficial plant parts include crossing branches or branches with poor branch angles. Proper technique in pruning is essential for wound recovery. And in order to make a proper cut, some branch components are going to be necessary for us to ID. First, we need to identify the branch bark ridge, which is this raised area of compressed bark between the main stem and the branch. The other part that is important to identify is the branch collar, which is typically located on the underside of the branch, typically close to the branch union. And together, these two will help us determine where we need to make our final pruning cut. No cut should ever be made inside this line. Inside this is called the branch protection zone, which contains specialized healing properties to help that wound seal properly. We're going to remove this smaller branch back to the primary stem or trunk. It's called the ternary method, which is actually 3 cuts. First, we're going to make our pre-cut, which is typically on the underside of the branch, and we're going to go in about 1/3 the diameter of the branch. And the purpose of this is to prevent the branch from tearing once we start making our second cut. This is our top cut, and we'll go about 2 inches or so past where our undercut is for the pre-cut. And then we start cutting. And as we cut, we're going to see the branch start to fall. And as it falls, it's going to stop right where that pre-cut is. So we can finish up. Now, that's 2 cuts. Remember, there's 3 parts to this. If we leave this is a stub which cannot support any type of leaves or branches to keep it alive. So all this will be is a conduit for decay. So what we're going to do is go outside the branch bark ridge and the branch collar, which we found earlier, and make our final cut. So we've got the smallest wound possible so it can heal quickly and effectively to seal off against any type of fungal organism which can cause decay. Once the cut is made, leave it to the tree to seal the wound and recover. Do not apply any wound dressings. Take in consideration timing of pruning. Never prune a tree which is drought stressed, and never remove excessive amounts of green tissue at any one time. Pruning can be done about any time the wood is not frozen. However, there are better times to perform this activity. This is during the growing season when the tree can seal the wound fastest, reducing decay. In any type of tree care operations, never let the situation exceed your skills. Pruning on larger trees can be dangerous for you and the tree. Call an ISA certified arborist for help with your tree care needs. For more details on proper pruning, go
Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you on that video. And just to kind of highlight what he mentioned there at the end, if you're needing someone to do some pruning on larger trees, you don't want to do it. And one of the other questions we get asked a lot is, who does pruning? And so what you want to look for is what's called an ISA. That stands for International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist. And so there are a handful of ISA certified arborists in the Central Oregon region. You can get on the ISA Certified Arborist website and try and find those, or we keep a list of those at our extension office too. You can give us a call and we can give you a list of names of people we know that are certified. Those folks are trained in proper pruning techniques. Okay. So he talked a little bit about that chemical reaction zone, and you want to make sure that you're making that pruning cut in the right place. This is kind of interesting. This was a photo time lapse of a tree that had some pruning done to it. Or no, actually this is what's showing you what happens if you prune and the pruning cut's not quite equal. You can see here, this is that wound tissue that develops over time. On the left here, you can see how it's kind of uneven. That means the pruning cut was probably not the cleanest cut. So you have this uneven development of the wound tissue. And here again on the right, this is on a pine tree or conifer. You can see the cut was probably too far in to that bark ridge. And so you're going to have this wound tissue trying to develop, but it can't quite complete development. So this is interesting. It's a photo time lapse of a pruning cut that was made on a tree, and the photos were taken through a 10-year period, and just kind of show you as you start to see progression here. If you make the pruning cut in the right location on a tree, then over time it will actually start to close and completely close. And then the last 4 years here of that same cut. And you can see it completely closes over time. If you make it in that right area, you'll have complete closure. If not, then you may or may not get closure. And there's the final. You can hardly tell there was a pruning cut made there. So here you can see examples of, again, just going too far, too deep, where you're just not going to get proper callus tissue there over time. And then you also open the tree up for a disease or insect if it doesn't heal correctly or close up correctly. So try and avoid making those flush cuts. You don't want to leave stubs too far out because they'll end up becoming potentially decay columns for the tree. And no need for any kind of pruning paint or sealant. It used to be a more common practice a long time ago, and so some folks still ask about it, but it's really not necessary. If you're making the pruning cut in the right location, the tree actually has the ability to compartmentalize or close over. What they found in research is that most of those sealants are paints. Some people would sometimes put tar, things like that. That actually seals in bacteria and pathogens and isn't helpful for the tree. Okay, and absolutely no topping of trees. As you can see, trees can just really respond poorly if there's indiscriminate pruning done. And here's just to share with you some really bad examples of pruning and what that can do to disfigure a tree. So branchlets in Seattle here. Yep, this one on the right is actually a sequoia that's been poorly pruned. Bad hair day. This is where you just had indiscriminate topping. And so sometimes when you do something like that, you'll get that flush of growth, but then what you're creating is weak-wooded, fast-growing branches that are not going to be strong. They're not going to have the right branch angle for longevity of the plant. Chicken on a stick here. This one, touch tone dialing. Those of us that remember touch tone dialing. So here's some examples, not the conifer in the middle, but the plant to the right and left of that, of topping. And again, if you just go straight across, you're gonna get that flush of growth. And what ends up happening if trees repeatedly get topped, you create a hazard tree over time where you have these upright branches that have weak angles that can come down in heavy storms. You also end up creating a platform for moisture to sit and accumulate, and you can end up having heart rot work its way down through the tree because you've got this flat top all of a sudden that's open to the inside of the plant where moisture can accumulate. Just another example of improper pruning. You don't want to leave stubs like this. You want to make sure you're making the right pruning cut. So if you top something like this, you know, you end up seeing something like this. So some might be like, well, that's okay. It kind of fills in, but no, over time, you're going to end up with some issues with that tree and its integrity. So you don't leave stubs. You want to make sure you go back to that branch collar. So just to give you a sense of response to pruning, the one on the left here just shows if you make a cut right in the center there, if you make a cut right here in the center, that branch, that bud to the right below where you made the cut, that's what you're going to see growth take off there. And if you make a cut to an opposite budded plant here, then you're going to have both of those lateral side buds take off and start to grow. So again, that's just showing you how the plant responds to your pruning cut. Already talked about that. And this is just showing you how you can change the direction of growth on a plant. So for your trees, depending on if you want the tree to go out wider or if you want it to go more upright, that's going to make a difference in the tree's response depending on which branches you choose to cut. So here you can see the ones, for example, up here, if you have a branch like this would be the desirable one to remove because you have the branch is starting to grow down towards the ground. It's not going to be a desirable branch angle. And so you want to go ahead and leave this one and take that one off, just to know how that'll change the tree and actually make the tree a little more narrow for at least a short period of time by removing that branch that's growing outward. And then for the one on the bottom photo here, you take any branch that's going straight up towards the sky, and then here you have this nice branch angle, so you would take off this one and allow this one to be opened up. When you're cutting back, you always want to cut back to a part of the plant that will grow and not leave any dead tissue behind. Usually you're not cutting back. If you have a branch that's, for example, 6 feet long, you really don't want to cut back, you know, any more than 3 feet, ideally to a bud, right above a bud, if you're going to cut just back to minimize some size. You can do a technique that's called crown lifting, where maybe this is the tree that's in the lawn that, you know, you keep hitting your head on every time you mow the lawn and you just need to get some branches up. Then you can kind of work the crown up. And there's also a technique to kind of work the crown down if you want a lower tree. This is sometimes really a good option for our fruit trees in particular, if you're trying to make them lower so you can access the fruit and manage the crop. If you're doing crown reduction, you can go in and do that. You just want to minimize how much you're doing and make sure you're making some proper pruning cuts. Crown thinning is a good technique to open up a crowded canopy. This is a good technique to use for pruning fruit trees as well. You're going to allow better airflow and light, and with increased airflow, you have less plant disease, and with increase in light, you're going to have better fruit production in your fruit trees and just overall a better, healthier tree by keeping that canopy opened up. So heading into a little bit more about pruning fruit trees, I mentioned early March is usually a good time here. So it's not too cold that you might encourage growth that might get zapped in the cold temperatures. You're probably okay by the time we start to head into March. It's going to be before it's leafing out, and you should be okay. One of the things you may want to think about with pruning a fruit tree, especially if you're starting with young trees, is keeping it small. There's some concepts and techniques out there where you can keep your fruit trees anywhere from 5 to 10 feet at maximum height. And so that makes it so that you don't have to get up on a ladder to manage it. If you're doing any type of pest management, you don't have to get up high, and makes it really easy for picking the fruit as well. Central leader, modified central leader, and vase are just some different techniques you can use for pruning fruit trees. You can look those up and pick whichever one you think is ideal. You do want to think about when you're pruning your fruit trees where the buds are that produce the fruit are located. So for apples and pears, cherries and plums, they produce their best fruit on 2 to 3 year old wood, whereas peaches produce their fruit on last year's vegetative growth. And so I'm going to show you an example here. On the left here, you can see this branch, hoping you guys can see this arrow that I'm using. This branch right here is where was the terminal bud from 2 years ago. So not 20, this is where it ended in 2018. That terminal bud broke loose and started to grow, and this was the growth we had in 2019. This is on a pear. So you can see how much growth there was. So if you go back, so that's 2019, 2 years, you can see here's a fruiting spur where you have the blossoms. This is the fruiting spur, and that's where you're going to get fruit production. So it's the same on apple trees as well. So you want to be thinking about that. If you're doing some pruning on your fruit trees, you want to know where the fruiting spurs normally occur, where the blossoms normally occur that produce fruit. And think about that as you're removing limbs and branches. Are you going to be removing some of the fruiting spurs? And just be aware of that. So you can see here on the left where that terminal bud, or it's called a terminal leaf scar, the leaf scar is, so you can kind of determine how many years back, if you want to, if you're not sure, like, I don't know how far back to go here, or what's safe, not safe for my apple tree. Look for that terminal scar that you see on the right hand side here, where you kind of have this callous tissue. That's where there's a division between 2 seasons worth of yearly growth. In general, for fruit trees, horizontal branches produce more fruit, and that's because you have direct sunlight hitting them. You're going to get more fruit production and higher quality fruit production if you leave horizontal branches versus upright ones, or ones that are kind of growing down towards the ground. I have a publication listed there. You can write down, give you a minute to write that down, or take a screenshot with your smartphone or something. They've got some nice information on pruning fruit trees. And I'll just show you, we will sometimes offer classes on pruning fruit trees if you have an interest in that. And just to show you, this was going back and retrofitting an existing fruit tree, and you can see that center, this large piece got taken out of the center that's laying on the ground here. And you can see in the center where that cut was made. This is to restore an apple tree. And the idea, this is more of orchard style pruning. So it doesn't quite follow the principles that I've been showing you most of this presentation, but orchard style pruning is different because you're trying to maximize fruit production and harvest yield. And so what is happening here is where canopy is being opened up to allow air and sunlight in. And so there's some modification going on an existing tree that had not been pruned before. Here's a younger fruit tree, and you can see there's just 4 limbs here. And this is another type where they take the central leader out, and you have these side branches, ideally with about a 45-degree angle, so that you're going to have flowers going up along the stem, kind of at that horizontal growth pattern, and you'll have maximized fruit. Okay, talking about shrubs here, There's basically 3 different shrub categories when it comes to pruning. And again, you always want to make sure you know when your ornamental shrubs are flowering, if you're going to do some pruning, to make sure you don't prune off those flower buds. But you've got, here are some examples of what are called cane growers. And these are going to be plants where you have multiple canes coming up and out of the ground from a central point. And so it's not just a single trunk, but you have multiple canes coming up and out of the ground. Some examples of plants that grow here that have the multiple canes would be 9-bark. We've got dogwoods, roses, viburnums, elderberry. The one in the photo there is an elderberry. Another category would be subshrubs, and an example of that would be your blue mist spireas, Russian sage, artemisia, some of the hydrangea can be subshrubs. And then you have your permanent framework plants. Examples of that would be our native manzanita. Rhododendron is a good example of a permanent framework. Holly, Daphne, not as common here. These are going to be ones that usually do not have multiple canes coming up, but they have more of a permanent structure or framework as indicated, and the way you prune them is going to be different. So for the cane growers, normally what you're doing is every couple of years you're thinning out the oldest canes. And so a lot of times what people will do is they will leave the larger canes and thin out the smaller canes coming up. But usually with cane growers, you want to do it the opposite way. You want to take out anything dead or damaged, and you're removing the canes. You're actually taking it all the way back down to the ground just to keep it from being too dense. Normally, and you can prune some back from the terminal top part of the branch in just to manage size a little bit, but don't go in more than about a third of the branch canopy and try and make nice pruning cuts. But usually for overall thinning and maintaining that cane grower, you want to take out the older canes and allow the younger ones, because then you'll have invigorated growth and more healthy growth over time. So here's an example, just diagram of how you would thin out a cane grower. So you've got multiple stems coming up. The dotted lines are going to be parts and pieces that you remove. So you can do some heading back from the outside part of the branch in, and then just removing some of the larger canes that come up from the base, and you just take them all the way back to the ground. Permanent framework, like your rhododendron, anything dead or damaged can be taken out. If you have an errant shoot, something kind of grown off on its own to the right or left, you can take that out. But just know these plants don't renew from the base. And so these permanent framework plants, if you cut it all the way down to the ground, you're not going to have new growth coming up. And if you have, you may just have some latent buds that start to come off that main, the main trunk from the ground. And so you want to make sure that you're not pruning too hard. Really, plants like this don't need a lot of pruning in most cases. You can do a little bit of heading back on them. Don't go back too far into old wood where there's no leaves showing, because you're probably going to prune back and not get any new growth. So you kind of want to just stay in the zone where you're still seeing leaves and just prune above a bud. Subshrubs are kind of in between. You can have multiple canes coming up from the base, but usually these ones have a more woody baseline to them, and you don't want to go all the way down to the ground necessarily. This is an example of Russian sage. You can see this one, you leave up something like Russian sage, you would leave up about 12 inches above ground, and then the new growth will come off of that and fill in later in the season. So you don't have to go down to the ground. If you were to go down to the ground on a subshrub, it'd probably be okay, but that's not the ideal recommendation. So about 12 inches above ground. And then shearing shrubs. And as I mentioned, shearing is just kind of indiscriminate. You can use, some people have electric shears, or you can use the head shears that I showed earlier. But I can only think of a handful of plants that use that grow here in Central Oregon. You know, in other places where you have yews and those types of plants, it's pretty easy to use shearing equipment, and the plants respond pretty well to that. But here we don't have a lot of plants that you can do that with. We do have some arborvitae, but they actually really don't prefer pruning. You can prune back just a little bit into the new growth on those if you needed to, for some reason, a little bit on some of the ornamental juniper, but you want to be really careful on how you do that, because if you go back too far into the old wood, you won't get recovery on those plants. Talk a little bit more about pruning conifers. Conifers, the majority of the ones that grow here in Central Oregon do not require pruning. Again, so only just taking out parts like dead or dying branches. You really don't want to be routinely pruning conifers because it will misshapen them and they don't respond well to pruning in general. So you've got that lateral bud, for example, on this diagram of a pine tree. Anywhere you see the needles have come off, you don't want to prune into that area on a pine tree, because if there's no needles there, there's not going to be any new needle growth coming out from those areas where the needles have already fallen off in previous seasons. Don't have latent buds there waiting to pop. So here's just a chart to show you, some of the more common type of conifers we have that grow in Central Oregon. And a couple that actually aren't very popular here. So the most common ones from this list would be the pine, the spruce, the juniper, fir, Doug fir. Yews are not very common here, arborvitae, a little bit in between. But you can see whether or not they have latent buds on the old wood and whether or not you should prune them. And you can see the list is pretty much a solid no, with the exception of yews. And again, yews just aren't that popular here. They don't perform as well as they do in other places. So here's that diagram of a pine. So going back, once you get to that place back here and you're in this zone, if you make a pruning cut back here for size management, just know you're just going to end up with a stub there. You're not going to get any growth coming from that response growth. There's no latent buds there as you get back. So if you want to try and manage your, say you have mugo pines in your landscape, you want to try and manage that. You would go ahead and pinch the candles back. So the candles are going to be this new growth that comes out early in the season. That's that terminal bud. It'll start to elongate, shoot up. It's starting to grow actively. You can go and just take your bypass pruners or anvil pruners even, or just snippers, and just snip that candle off. That'll stunt the growth or dwarf the plant a little bit. And so you can do that every season safely if you're trying to manage the size of a pine tree or a shrub, a conifer shrub. Here's what happens if you do hard pruning on some of these evergreens or conifers that don't like it. You're going to go back and you're just going to have dead wood. Here are some resource pages I'm going to leave up here. And I'll bring this back for you in a minute. I just want to, so there are some good guides out there that are available for pruning. And I'll leave these up in, let's see. There's the P&W ISA, which is that International Society of Horticulture if you're looking for a certified arborist. Bring that page back. And I'll leave that up here as I answer questions. I just want to show you one more example and then I'll bring those resource pages back. This is a spring snow crabapple tree at our demonstration garden in Redmond. And I just want you to see this is a tree that's been pruned with proper technique. And so the ideal tree as far as pruning goes, it really should be a tree where you don't notice. If the tree's been properly pruned, it should look like it's not been pruned. It should just have a nice shape to it. And so that's the goal you're trying to achieve. Here's an example of one that's been pruned, because crabapples get a lot of extra growth in them, but it should have a nice shape to it when you're done pruning, and you shouldn't really be able to see where it's been pruned. Okay, I'm going to bring back those pages, and now I'm going to go ahead, and that's all I have today to